When we think about the value of archaeology for a field where we already have a pre existing base of knowledge, that being the application of archaeology to ancient Greece and Rome, we see that it serves as an excellent supplement and even as a corrective in some cases. There are also instances where we might have the general feel for what a civilization is like, but then we find sites that for whatever reason never made it into any of our literary records. And so we end up learning a whole lot about this society that we could not have learned just from the literary record. But to fully appreciate exactly what archaeology is capable of providing in terms of enhancing our knowledge, we really need to look at areas where we don't have a great deal of literary survival and where the vast majority of what we learned is from the archaeology. So what I'd like to do is consider what we knew about Egypt and the ancient Near East prior to the dawn of archaeology some 200 years ago. If we really think about what we knew about early civilization before archaeology, it amounts to very, very little. And what I hope to show by going from Egypt all the way through the other major civilizations of the Bronze Age is that prior to archaeological discoveries, what we knew was laughably meager. And in the last 200 years, the amount that we've learned about humanity's early past is astounding. Even the literary record of that period, which had been lost, was only uncovered and deciphered due to the work of archaeology. So let us consider what our knowledge of these civilizations was like prior to archaeology, and what a knowledge of these civilizations would be like had scholars not gotten into the investigation of the material past. Of all the civilizations that we're going to discuss today, the one which was best understood prior to the discovery of archaeology was Egypt. Obviously, as most of you know, Egyptologists have uncovered all kinds of things which have radically changed our understanding of ancient Egypt, but still, we did know at least some things prior to archaeology. A lot of what we know came to us from a writer named Manetho who lived in the 3rd century BCE. He was an Egyptian priest, but he wrote in Greek. Now, part of the reason for that is that Greek had become the lingua franca of intellectuals in the ancient world by that time, and also he worked sometime during the reign of the first 3 Ptolemaic kings of Egypt, and they founded an institution called the Museum, where scholars would get together and they would instruct the public and then also work on literary records and also the preservation of text. So Manetho was most likely employed by the museum, and he would have been tasked with recording Egyptian history for a Greek audience, so that way these manuscripts could then be stored in the library, which was a part of the museum, and possibly copied and distributed. Manetho did a fairly thorough investigation of Egyptian history by traveling around from site to site, interviewing different priests, and reading hieroglyphics as best he could. We suspect that his knowledge of hieroglyphics was far from complete, however. It was Manetho, and not modern scholars, who decided to organize Egypt into kingdoms, intermediary periods, and dynasties. Kingdoms are broad periods of time where Egypt is unified over a long stretch of time. Perhaps there could be a civil war where a new dynasty arises, but it is a time of unification and prosperity. An intermediary period usually follows the fall of a dynasty and some climate turmoil where harvests are poor or flooding does not occur as people would want, and then we have regional powers vying for control and no one is strong enough to unite Egypt. And the dynasties are just the ruling families, often located in different cities. So sometimes power will shift within the period of a kingdom from, say, Thebes to Memphis or other sites such as those. And all of that comes to us from Manetho. Interestingly enough, most modern archaeology by Egyptologists has more or less confirmed Manetho's findings, and his system works well enough that we actually still use it. There have been some things where we found that maybe he wasn't quite accurate. The most famous example that everyone knows about is that he says that Egypt was united for the first time under a ruler named Menes. But in the archaeological record, the first person whose remains we find all over Egypt, thus indicating that this person united the country, is a man named Narmer. So perhaps he got the name wrong, or he's using a different form of the name that we're unfamiliar with. But it's also just simply possible that he got bad information somehow. Another example is that Manetho does not really seem to have any awareness of what happened prior to the Old Kingdom. But because of archaeology now, we know that Egypt had civilization or proto-civilization for centuries prior to the birth of the Old Kingdom. Of course, the Old Kingdom is best known for the pyramids that were built under the 4th dynasty. But by then, even though Egypt was still fairly young in terms of its run as a great civilization, it wasn't quite as young as we used to think. We used to think that the Egyptians, at sort of the outset of their civilization, sort of emerged from nowhere and then started building pyramids, but in fact, they actually had quite a bit more experience under their belts by that point than we had recognized before, just following Manetho and other sources. We also have other ancient sources who talk about the Egyptians here or there. Herodotus talks about different aspects of Egyptian culture in his own time, including how to deal with mosquitoes. He also mentions the pyramids, but curiously not the Sphinx. And, well, part of the reason is that in Egypt, by the time of Herodotus, Egypt had gotten a lot drier. And this meant that the sands could easily cover up even massive monuments like the Sphinx. So most likely when Herodotus visited the pyramids and then climbed up and wrote his name on the top of the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx was so covered in sand that he had no indication that it was there. So basically what I'm telling you is that without archaeology, we would only have a very vague impression of what happened in Egypt. We'd have the outline pretty much right, but we wouldn't really know the early stages too well. And we also would have no idea about exactly how many monuments there were, or what Egyptian cities were like. That's something that archaeologists have been trying their best to discover, especially in more recent times. We found most of the great burial monuments, but what do the cities look like? Well, that's an answer that only archaeologists will be able to yield, since Manetho himself, being a priest, was really into monuments that the early archaeologists were into, as in the great burial chambers and all of that. And so most of what we know has to come from modern investigations. And by the way, this volume of Manetho is much, much slimmer than almost any other volume in the Loeb series that I've ever encountered. When I got it, I was actually shocked at how thin it was. And also, a lot of what's there are fragments taken from other texts where people will cite Manetho for his knowledge of ancient Egypt. So this text is not in great shape, and what it does provide is rather limited, although the quality of Manetho's work is pretty high in terms of coming up with a really good organizational scheme. However, once we get beyond Egypt, we'll see that the real rule of thumb here is that we really didn't know much of anything about what the world was like in the Bronze Age prior to archaeology. Thanks to modern archaeology, we now know that the Bronze Age began around 3300 BCE, and it began in southern Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians were the first to develop writing, irrigation, and city dwelling. Before this, what little knowledge we had of the Bronze Age was entirely confined to what is known as the Late Bronze Age. That is the period from about 1600 BCE down to as late as 1100. But that is only a small fraction of the entire Bronze Age. The only civilization we knew about that had a pre-Late Bronze Age period would have been Egypt. We had a pretty good idea of how old the pyramids were, so we knew that those predated civilization in the Near East by hundreds of years. But then as we continued to dig, we found out, wait, there actually was a civilization in Mesopotamia a little bit earlier than there was in Egypt. And that's even after accounting for the fact that Egypt ended up being hundreds of years older than we realized. So how did we know so little about the ancient Near East, and where did our information come from? Well, just as a lot of what we knew about Egypt came to us from two Greek writers, Herodotus and Manetho, so too did the writings of the Greeks play a big role in what we knew about the Near East. Although, to be fair, Greek writing really only appears around the year 700 or so BCE, and so most of the Greek writers who were talking about this area were talking about contemporary civilizations, including the Neo-Assyrians. The other major source, which was much more vital to the way that people looked at the Near East, was the Old Testament. The Old Testament, of course, tries to explain the role of the Jewish people in the history of the ancient Near East. And they were very much focused on that particular period, the late Bronze Age, where they saw the Hebrew civilization emerge. Another factor really militating against a deeper knowledge of this period is that European visitors to the Near East, of whom there were many, always assumed that tells were a natural part of the landscape. They assumed that these were just some little hills here and there, and no one thought, oh, those are deposit layers because of human activity over time. Now, some antiquities hunters and locals knew that there were things buried in them, but the kinds of people who would go in and actually investigate these things systematically had no idea that there was anything there to systematically investigate. There were suspicions that civilization in the ancient Near East must be old, especially when people started to study linguistics and get a feel for how long it takes languages to evolve and differentiate. But really, there was not a great understanding of exactly how old civilization there might be. And it was assumed for a very long time that Egypt was the birthplace of civilization, then it had spread eastward from there. Whereas in reality, we know that early Egypt most likely got a lot of its ideas and influences from Mesopotamia before it started to develop its own distinctive culture. When the earliest archaeological investigators arrived in Mesopotamia, they were looking for the remains of two particular peoples, the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The Assyrians were mostly located in the north of Mesopotamia, whereas the Babylonians were located sort of in the middle around the modern city of Baghdad. The Assyrians were something like the big bads of the Old Testament. Their empire was at its peak in the sort of late Bronze Age and then again in the early Iron Age. They were the first major power to really come back from what is sometimes called the Dark Age after the late Bronze Age. So they bounced back with a vengeance. The Neo-Assyrian Empire has scythed chariots, which were the most fearsome war machines of their day, and they ended up conquering most of their neighbors. Among the neighbors they conquered were the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judea, centered around Jerusalem. Hence their inclusion in the Bible and the famous passage where it was said that the only weapon that God could not defeat were the iron chariots of the Assyrians. So clearly this left a pretty strong impression on all of the early Iron Age observers, including the people who wrote the Old Testament. And also, even though the Assyrians were a thing of history by the time the Greeks were really recording history, they also had awareness of what the Assyrians had been and of some of the customs of the Assyrians. The Assyrians also invented crucifixion, for instance, which of course would be continued on by some other civilizations that they came in contact with, whether directly or indirectly. As for Babylon, the understanding of it was that it was this great sprawling city along the Tigris and Euphrates, which was effectively a den of sin. It was often used as an example of degeneracy, kind of like Sodom or Gomorrah, but its main role in the Old Testament was to serve as the place where the Israelites were sent into exile following the Assyrian conquest. The Assyrians, like many other empires, liked to try to make people more cooperative by separating out populations and moving people from their home area to another area where they would be a distinct minority, and they'd be less likely to be able to work with the locals in order to overthrow the imperial government. So that was basically about all that was known about Babylon prior to archaeological investigation. So if you think about what we now know as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, they were only discovered incidentally as people were looking for evidence of, say, the Hebrews living around Babylon, or looking for evidence in the Assyrian cities and happening to find older stuff that they didn't expect to find. In many ways, you could argue that we discovered the history of the ancient Near East in reverse order. We started out with the more recent stuff and then discovered the more ancient stuff. And in a way, it kind of had to be that way, because the way that we found cuneiform scripts and tablets, we found languages that were more familiar to modern linguistics, languages that were more easily decipherable. And from there, we were able to recognize similar scripts but different languages, and then work from there to get to more and more ancient languages. So by the time we found the Sumerian language, we realized it was not Semitic, and that was a bit of a surprise. And the area where civilization was born was not exactly the most obvious choice for a civilization to spring up, because it's not as hospitable as some of the areas more to the north. And it also exposed to us, at least for the archaeological community for about the first time, that there can be fairly significant ecological change in a fairly short amount of geological time. So just in several thousand years, Sumeria went from a place which could sustain a number of large city-states to being a place where large-scale agriculture is effectively impossible, even with modern agricultural technology. Most scholars now believe that the various books of the Old Testament were committed to writing between 800 and 500 BCE. There are people who contend that all of these books were based upon older oral traditions, but that is largely immaterial to what we're talking about right now. The authors of the various books of the Old Testament were concerned with the geopolitics of their own time, and so that is why, for instance, the Assyrians, who we talked about earlier, feature so prominently. One group which does appear in the Old Testament but is portrayed as being rather small were the Hittites. By the time the Old Testament is being written, the surviving Hittites are inhabitants of Syria who sometimes play a marginal role in interacting with the Hebrew civilization. But certainly they're not a major power. And so when scholars who were raised on the Bible went to do archaeological investigations, they were expecting to find out that the Hittites controlled a few cities and they were just some short-lived little civilization. What they found instead is that centered in eastern Turkey, there actually was a major power from the late Bronze Age, which very much had an influence on all of its neighbors, and which was just as powerful as any of them. The Hittite Empire at its peak was a threat to all of its neighbors, and they conducted a pretty lively trade. The Hittites, for instance, in 1531, under the leadership of Mursili I, managed to sack Babylon, and thus brought one of the dynasties there to an end. They also fought and won a battle against Ramses II of New Kingdom Egypt, in the first ever recorded battle in history at Kadesh in 1274 BCE. The two powers were fighting over the border of what was then known as Canaan. So the Hittites were a hugely important power who had been largely lost to history. Because of the reach of the Hittites and the extent of their power, there are also quite a few people who believe that when the Trojans in the Iliad received heavy reinforcements from the interior, that the reinforcements were from the Hittite Empire, and that the city of Ilion was also the city of Walusa recorded in Hittite sources, and that it was a vassal or some sort of outlying satellite of the Hittite Empire. There also have been people who have thought that perhaps the Hittite Empire was in a cold war of sorts with the Mycenaean Greeks, and that the whole war for Troy was sort of a proxy war or a border skirmish between these two civilizations. So it is amazing how much our perception of the Hittites and their role in history has changed dramatically based on investigating their archaeology. When we were basing it entirely on the Old Testament, we only got a very partial portrait of it from a specific moment in time, which ended up being extremely misleading, and now we know that the Hittites were actually extraordinarily important to the history of their time. It's hard to overstate just how important the Bible was for how people understood the ancient Near East. Many of the scholars, if not all of them, were fairly ardent religious believers, and they were very familiar with what the Bible had to say on a number of topics. So for them, a large part of their mission, and a large part of why they got as much money as they did, was that they endeavored to go and prove the truth of the Bible by finding things from it. So a lot of early archaeologists wanted to find sites such as Sodom and Gomorrah or Jericho, and by finding sites from the Bible that had been lost to time, they would prove that these events must have happened. And that was one thing that drove a lot of early expeditions. One of the central points of the Old Testament was to describe and elevate the role of Jerusalem in the ancient world. In especially the Old Testament, Jerusalem was a capital city and an imperial center. The Hebrews had a bit of an empire going under David and Solomon, and they were apparently some of the most powerful regional rulers, if the Bible is to be believed. However, when archaeologists decided to investigate and look for signs of the empire, such as mile markers and signs of garrisons of what would be Israeli troops or anything of that nature, they couldn't find anything. And when they looked at Jerusalem itself, it became apparent that this town was not an imperial center. It probably only had about 10,000 or so people right up until we get to about the period when the Old Testament's being written, when the city starts to expand quite a bit. So at the time when David and Solomon supposedly lived, Jerusalem was a very small, quiet place. And most likely the early rulers, who may very well have been named David or Solomon, were ruling over Jerusalem and a few of the areas right around it, but nothing more than that. It certainly wasn't an empire. We have to keep in mind that just as for the early archaeologists a lot of their work was driven by faith, so too it is the case that a lot of modern investigators are also driven by their faith to try to find anything which tries to validate what's in the Bible. And to that end, there are quite a few archaeologists who have been trying as hard as humanly possible to prove that the kingdom of Israel to the north of Judea was in fact a part of a unified kingdom in the time of the Bronze Age. But all of the archaeological data suggest that in fact there were two separate kingdoms, Judea and Israel, and that in the north in Israel, while it was very culturally similar to what was going on in Judea, there was a big difference, and that is that the Israelites of the north were never Hebrew. There's no evidence that they were monotheist. There's no evidence that they gave up eating pork. In fact, the evidence is that they were pagan, just like the majority of people, but they happened to share the same language and basic culture as the people to the south. That's pretty odd, right? So, how do we make sense of all of that? Well, there actually is a theory which is gaining a lot of traction and which I think has a lot of merit, especially in light of all of the material evidence. And that theory comes to us from Neil Asher Silberman and Israel Finkelstein in their book The Bible Unearthed, Archaeology's New Vision of Ancient Israel and the Origin of its Sacred Text. The basic idea is that as Jerusalem is emerging as a major center, it really starts to grow because of the fall of Israel to the north, There are refugees who come in, so the city grows more quickly, and the kings of Jerusalem latch onto that in order to try to make a claim for the land in the north. So effectively, they invent a lot of backstory and back history in order to give themselves a deeper past and a claim to more of the land around them. And at this point, Jerusalem is legitimately growing. And partly because of that expansion and growth, that is why they attract the attention of the Assyrians, who eventually come in and force Jerusalem to capitulate. And this results also in the destruction of the Temple of Solomon. So, another thing we've learned from archaeology over time, and this is outside of the Silberman and Finkelstein book, is that the Phoenicians, the great explorers of antiquity, shared a very similar language to the people of Judea. Not the religion, but they did share the language. And culturally, they were very similar. In the Old Testament, we see that the Hebrew people migrated out of slavery in Egypt, slaughtered a lot of the local Canaanites, and then settled in their land. But archaeologically, we see no evidence of a great migration out of Egypt. It looks like the people around Judea just sort of stayed around there and started the city, and it grew over time. And it also looks like there was never any real rivalry between the inland Canaanites, who became the Hebrews, and their coastal cousins, who became the Phoenicians. It looks like all of this was invented later to justify something like a religious revolution where the religion of Judaism was born. And in that sense, this is also similar to the kinds of cultural revolutions that we saw in many places in the world around that same time, in the archaic and classical period. We saw a massive revolution in Athens which created the world's first democracy. And that involved quite a bit of creating new backstory and fundamentally shifting the way that people organize themselves. In Sparta, they had a major revolution where they became a hardcore military state, and a state ruled by a small number of professional warriors who literally tyrannized and terrorized the locals. So yes, these kinds of transformations are possible, and right now this does constitute the best explanation of the evidence such as we have it. But of course, as time goes on and we continue to unearth more things, we will undoubtedly change the story some to fit with the new evidence. And that applies to all the civilizations I've talked about. There's still more to be learned. We're never quite done discovering new things and reevaluating what the past was really like. So, that was sort of a general rundown of what people believed prior to archaeology, and sort of a picture of where we're at now. And so I hope that you can realize from this precisely how far we've come and exactly how we got to where we are now.